Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. Now, the importance of financial inclusion to grow Nigeria's economy cannot be overemphasized, which is why the subject matter continues to gain momentum in the country's policy and economic development. Here to give us the latest data on Nigeria's journey to reach 70% of the population with formal financial services is the CEO of EFINA, that's Enhancing Financial Innovation and Access, Ashley Immanuel. Good to have you join us on the program, Ashley.
Nice to be here.
Okay, so let's start with financial inclusion. For anyone who is watching at the moment and is not aware of what that means, can you define for us or tell us, what financial inclusion is all about?
So financial inclusion is creating a financial system that is accessible, affordable, and relevant for everybody in this case, Nigeria. So all Nigerians, particularly low-income groups.
Oh, great. Well, let's start with what's really happening with the financial survey. And, I read a survey by your firm that indicated that 27% of Nigerian adults are considered financially healthy, while 39% are financially coping, and another 39% financially vulnerable. And it's understood that Nigeria needs a range of these services to help boost this ratio. So can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So exactly as you said, people need a range of financial services in order to be able to meet their needs. So people have different needs. They need to be able to manage their day-to-day expenses and have money when they need it to meet those expenses. They need to be able to manage risk. So if a family member, particularly an income earner, falls ill or something else, another risk kind of incident happens for a household, they need to be able to manage that. They need to be able to meet goals, so save for things like education or maybe building a house or buying a house, etc. So people have a range of different needs. And when in our survey, the EFINA Access to Financial Services in Nigeria 2020 survey, one of the things that we measure is the financial health of Nigerian adults, and really whether they're able to meet those various needs. And as you mentioned, unfortunately, only about one quarter, so 27% of Nigerian adults are considered financially healthy. And in fact, what we saw in the data is that many particularly struggle to manage those day-to-day expenses, and as well as manage risk, which was particularly important in the past year given the COVID pandemic, which really added sort of more strain and more crises to some of the households in Nigeria.
Now, actually, I did read your report and survey as well, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, because there were quite a number of numbers, pardon the pun. In 2018, we had about 40% of Nigerians who banked. In 2020, it was 45%. This year, from what I read, it's 51%. The rate of progression is actually very slow, isn't it?
Yeah, so actually, and to your point about a lot of numbers, there are a lot of numbers and we measure some different things, so it can be a little bit confusing. So we track the percentage of Nigerian adults who are banked, and as you've mentioned, the percentage is currently 45%. So 45% of Nigerian adults have or are using banking services. Another thing that we track is how many Nigerian adults use what we call formal or regulated financial services. So that's the number who are banked, plus those who aren't banked but might use another formal or regulated service, such as a microfinance bank or mobile money, etc. And so when you add those together, the current data in 2020 shows that the total formally served population is 51%. So we have seen growth in both metrics between 2018 and 2020, which is encouraging, particularly given the pandemic, which was presented difficult economic circumstances for Nigerian families. At the same time, 51% is still very far from 100%. So it shows that we still have a lot more to do.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the proximity of financial service points to communities and how it affects financial inclusion. What can be done to bridge the gap between those, especially in rural areas, and access to financial service points to further enhance this inclusion? And how will financial inclusion bridge income inequality while combating poverty as well as preserving social harmony?
So those are some very good questions, particularly because we do see a really large gap in financial inclusion between urban and rural Nigerians. So for example, in urban areas, about 2/3 of adults are banked, whereas in rural areas, only about 1/3 of Nigerian adults are banked. So it's very important that we do think about ways to creatively address that gap. One of the ways that this can be done is through financial service agents. So there are many in rural areas. Oftentimes, the challenge is that banks are just too far away. So using agents, such as perhaps a shopkeeper who actually lives within a rural community, and that person being sort of licensed and trained and fully equipped to serve as an agent of a bank or another financial service provider. Those agents can help really extend the reach of financial services into rural areas. And in fact, something that we've seen that's really encouraging in our 2020 survey. So we conduct this survey every 2 years. We've been doing it since 2008. So we can see change over time in financial inclusion. And in 2020, we saw a really large growth in the percentage of Nigerian adults who say that they're using financial service agents. So that's very encouraging, and it really shows the opportunity for further growth in financial inclusion. So the agents are one piece. A second piece that's really important is having digital financial services. Oftentimes mobily enabled, like mobile money. We see more Nigerian adults now own mobile phones, about 81%. So adults in rural areas who can really transact using mobile money or mobile banking services, and then have an agent in their community to do some important things like opening accounts or cashing in or cashing out. That combination can really help drive further financial inclusion in rural areas.
Now, when we talk about financial inclusion, and we talk about that with regards to the gender gap, there's a huge disparity, isn't there? Why is that? Because from some of the figures that I've seen here, 50.6% for men, 39.1% for women.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right, and that's really important. So one of the things that we see is that there are these big gaps in access, including, we talked about the urban-rural gap, but the gender gap in access is also really important. Unfortunately, the gender gap in financial inclusion really hasn't decreased very much since we started measuring in 2008. So that shows that it's really an important priority for us to address in Nigeria. There are many reasons for that. IFINA did a deep dive assessment of women's financial inclusion in Nigeria a couple of years ago, which really gets into some of the detail. So some of the reasons are, so there are some things that are obstacles to financial inclusion really for all adults. So things like poor access to banks or agents, things like low levels of education or income are correlated with low levels of financial inclusion. And we know in Nigeria that there are gaps in education, employment, income between men and women. So that contributes. But there are also some factors that show that really the formal financial sector is not reaching women in Nigeria as effectively as it could. So even when we hold everything else equal, we see that women are less likely to use regulated financial services than men. And that means that we need to do more in terms of really designing for women specifically. So we need to think about, how does, in a woman's journey to use financial services, is she able to travel to the access point? If she's going to meet an agent, is that agent a woman? Sometimes that makes a difference. Is she able to fill out the forms? Does she have the ID or the proof of address document required? If not, we need to really redesign our approach with women in mind specifically so we can reach them better.
Well, thank you very much for your input on this segment.